For Creamer Media's Polity, Tabi Madiba, author Masande Ntshanga joins me to discuss his book titled Triangulum. Welcome, Masande.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Can you briefly take us through the process of writing this book and the inspiration behind it?
Well, it began with me wanting to essentially write a story about the homeland system. I spent some of my childhood there. I grew up in the Ciskei before the homelands were discontinued. And over the years, it's a setting I've always wanted to return to, but I didn't quite know how to. All I remembered was that I had this experience of the environment as sort of eerie in a way that kind of did remind me of science fiction in a way. And so I worked on a few other things, in the interim until at some point the story wouldn't let me go. And I realized that if I wanted to write about it, then I couldn't do it straight. I had to kind of honor this feeling that I'd had, that it felt like sci-fi. And so that kind of began, the inspiration of it. And then the more I worked on it, the more the other stuff started coming into it as well. That it shouldn't just be an exploration of the past, but also of the present and the future.
Okay, and what was your biggest challenge in combining the science fiction and the historical fiction to recreate the world of Triangulum?
Well, I guess it was to make it plausible, it was, and also to kind of make it gel so that when people are invested in the historical narrative, they're not alienated by the science fiction, so that the progression feels natural. So that was the challenge, but it was also the most kind of rewarding part, to kind of look at aspects of our society and go like, okay, this is weird. If I extended this, it could actually be a viable science fiction subplot.
And talk to us about the character of the narrator and why you didn't give her the name.
Well, there's two reasons really. The first is that we can't know her identity because she's involved in all these subversive activities, right? And she doesn't want to be tracked down. She makes that very clear. So in the book's world, we can't know who she is. But also, the more I worked on it, I became fascinated by this idea of not naming the narrator, because I wanted it to almost feel as if the story could be narrated by anyone, in the sense that if it's not tied to a particular character with a name and an identity, it kind of opens itself up more to interpretation. So even you as a reader, or myself as a reader, are able to kind of project ourselves more into the character and what they go through.
And briefly talk to us about the narrator's journey in search of her missing mother and her inexplicable visions of a great machine and series of triangles.
Well, the subplot about her searching for her mother is actually quite central to the story, because essentially, there's a lot of stuff that happens in the book, but really it's a story about family at its core. So I kind of also wanted to explore that, the bond between a child and a parent, a daughter and a mother, and have that kind of be the emotional and psychological focus point of the book as it explored all the other theories. And in terms of the visions, I guess I was interested in this idea of exploring mental illness in a way that looked outside of its formulations by the West. What does it mean actually, to have visions, and what does it mean to be mentally ill, within an African context, or even a South African context for that matter.
And the book is set in post-apartheid SA, and you incorporate the effects of discrimination and oppression. Why was it important for you to showcase the impact in a science fiction novel?
Because it's science fiction. I guess my experience of science fiction has always been a form that critiques society and power, so it came very naturally, in fact. The more I started thinking about it, the more I thought, if you take a step back and you look at apartheid and you look at its structures, it was actually kind of a very, very, very bizarre system, of governance, and incredibly inhumane as well, which is not something that's foreign in science fiction, stories. And but I didn't want it to be that explicit. Instead, I wanted it to be kind of teased out, through what survives from apartheid in our everyday reality now, in our present, its legacy rather, yeah.
And the book seems to be a mix of many genres. How do you balance this while keeping the story on track?
I planned it. I planned it. It was important that the stories work together, but yes, it is a blend of genres. And that primarily came as a result of me wanting to explore the idea of the three-act narrative, which is stories that have a beginning, middle, and end. In my previous work, I worked with a structure that was very different to that because I felt it was too simple. But I wanted to explore it with this book, and I guess I used different genres so that I could explore it at least 3 times in different ways of telling stories until I was satisfied.
And many are not keen on defining your book genre. How do you define the book?
I like calling it science fiction. I mean, generally it's literary fiction, but I don't actually mind calling it science fiction. I liked science fiction when I was a teenager, and I still do. Growing up for a period of time, it's where I basically deposited my imagination. So I like calling this book science fiction because it's kind of a nod, to my younger self.
Okay. And you also tackle environmental issues throughout the book. Was this influenced by South Africa's own issues with water shortages?
I started thinking about them before, actually. It was kind of popular in our media that there were shortages, water shortages in Cape Town, etc. I've always kind of thought about the environment in that way, It's kind of always at the back of my mind. It's like a vague concern. And also just living in Johannesburg, and experiencing the levels of like air pollution, and just kind of wondering if ever we are going to find a way to address these issues like efficiently. So they were always there at the back of my head, and then suddenly they were in the news as well, with the shortages, and that was just something that tied in almost coincidentally.
And lastly, towards the end of your book, you state that human animals are poisoned but not dead. Please explain to us what you meant.
So basically that character, what she means is that the human animal, as humans, humankind, and all the trials that we've been through, and what we've done to our habitat, Earth, and all this damage, all of it is kind of like cause for despair, to believe that things can never get better, and what's waiting for us is extinction. But at the same time, by saying that we're not dead yet, it means that there's still a chance to turn things around.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was author Masande Ntshanga speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about Triangulum.